Hello, my name is Dr. Emma Ferguson-Coleman. I am a Deaf Research Fellow based at the University of Manchester. I've been working with deaf people living with dementia and their families for over 10 years. I achieved my PhD in 2016 in relation to stories of deaf people living with dementia and their families. So I'm here to share their stories today. I am deaf, so the voice that you can hear is that of my sign language interpreter. I'm really fortunate to be able to receive support from the Quality Act, which enables me to book an interpreter, and they're paid for through Access to Work. Because of this legislation that supports me as a deaf citizen, I'm able to do that. However, the stories I'm going to share with you now highlight the lack of opportunities that deaf people and their families have when it comes to accessing healthcare and support. So I'll share their stories with you today. First, I'd like to start off by talking about dementia and what that is and what that means. It means that somebody's going through challenges when it comes to communication, memory, mobility, plus other issues. And it can have a multi-layered impact on them, their family, their friends, and also society in general. So it's how that person living with dementia can maintain a positive aspect, but also living well with dementia. So if you're deaf living with dementia, well, what does that mean? Well, we know that it's an estimated number of deaf people living with dementia in the UK, and how we work that out is by applying the principle of there being 850,000 hearing people living with dementia, and then applying that to the deaf community. So you've got 87,000 sign language users within the UK. So applying that estimate brings it to 450 to 850 deaf sign language users living with dementia in the UK. However, that figure could be larger because we know that deaf people, as they age, will maybe move into care homes. These care homes will be a hearing care home because of the lack of deaf care home provision across the UK. So they're more likely to be put into a care home where communication isn't provided in sign language. So they may develop dementia, but there's no evidence of that. So the person living in a care home may not have access to sign language, so there's communication barriers within that placement. So today I'm going to share with you some of my research. So over the past 10 years within the University of Manchester, I've met with different research participants over the years that I've shared their stories and experience of barriers to accessing healthcare, barriers to diagnosis, and also barriers to support. So I'll share those stories with you today. I've got 3 particular stories. So the first story is a family who wanted a diagnosis. So they booked an appointment with a consultant. They met with a consultant on the day. There was an interpreter present, but the interpreter didn't meet the family's communication needs. They were a training interpreter, which from the booker's perspective, it's a cheaper option because they're still in training. Unfortunately, they weren't qualified enough to be able to facilitate communication, particularly when they were trying to ascertain more about the dementia and their experience of living with dementia. So the clinician had to really think about making sure that a qualified interpreter was booked. Bearing in mind, the clinician will not understand the levels of interpreters and what the difference between a trainee and a qualified interpreter, and making sure that the interpreter that's appointed has the experience of being able to facilitate communication. And it would be a challenge for even qualified interpreter, so it's just making sure that that interpreter that's appointed has the linguistic understanding of being able to facilitate communication with somebody living with dementia. So they needed that experience. So the second story is about a family that had been through diagnosis, so they wanted additional support. They wanted to look at what options were available. There's no specialist support for deaf sign language users living with dementia within the UK. There's nothing at all available, which means that local day centres would have to provide that support. So there is deaf clubs, so each town will have a deaf club. Some unfortunately are closing, but there's still some deaf clubs that remain open, but they don't have the experience or the knowledge of how to support someone living with dementia. So whether they're the right place, they should be the right place to offer this support, but there's a lack of understanding and awareness there of how to support their peers through their journey. I'll explain that later. So this story concerns a lady that's deaf, just being diagnosed with dementia, and she wanted to go somewhere where she could receive additional support and get out the flat. So there's a local hearing day centre that offered arts and crafts, so she wanted to get involved. They didn't book a sign language interpreter, unfortunately, so she tried to keep up with lip reading the instructions, was missing out on information, wasn't sure what to do. So what she did was she banged on the table because she wanted to get somebody's attention. She wanted to ask for repetition, she wanted to ask for clarification. But how the hearing facilitators took it was that she was being aggressive because they didn't understand the deaf cultural norms. So they asked her to leave, which is sad because actually she wasn't being aggressive. She just wanted to communicate in her language, but that was misconstrued, and they didn't follow the Equality Act. They didn't think about how they were discriminating against this, lady, and how she could have participated better. So the third story is a gentleman that was married to a deaf lady, come from a deaf family, always been involved in the deaf community. For 40 years, he would attend the deaf club on a weekly basis, very proud member of the deaf community. He developed dementia, so throughout his journey, he still wanted to maintain that contact with the deaf club. He wanted to live well with dementia, so he made that decision of still wanted to be involved in the deaf community, even though it posed challenges for him and his wife. So they realised, as they maintained that connection with the deaf club, he was often involved in a group where they would play dominoes and cards. So he maintained that connection and he tried to keep up with the group, and he found it difficult. He soon realised he was becoming too slow, and that was his exact words, he was too slow. So they actually told him that he needed to leave the group. It was better off for him to leave the group. He was really disappointed by this. That's his lifelong lived experience of being involved in this group, and now suddenly he didn't fit in anymore. I was shocked when he was telling me this story because I believed that he deserved to maintain that. He deserved to be involved in that group, but the deaf community are not ready. They're part of their own minority community. They're not experienced enough to know how to support their peers. His wife faced her own difficulties. She was now suddenly a full-time carer, needing that additional support. So she asked her husband whether he was happy to stay and have a visitor, while she just nipped out and went to spend some time with her friends in the deaf club for herself. So she went, everything was put in place. She attended the deaf club, but with a cup of tea she sat down and suddenly she was a bad person. She should have stayed at home and looked after her husband. She shouldn't be out. So there's that lack of understanding, so that the lack of knowledge. So how can deaf carers receive support but still maintain that caring role? So she needed that breakaway to be able to fulfill that role. So there's still lots of work to do. So moving forward, we need to build awareness about dementia. We need to understand how we can support deaf people and their families to enable them to be equal citizens within society.